Tonight's panel is chaired by Stephen Pollard, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, and an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who has written for major newspapers worldwide, including The Times, The Daily Mail, and The Wall Street Journal. Our distinguished panel comprises leading journalist Tim Marshall, whose posts include foreign and diplomatic editor at Sky News, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and Professor Colin Schindler of the Near and Middle East Department at SOAS. And we're particularly grateful to him for stepping in at the last minute to take the place of Baroness Neville-Jones, who sends her apologies. She's stuck in the House of Lords with a motion of her own that unexpectedly came up tonight, which I hope you'll agree is a pretty good excuse. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in such large numbers, as it were, and thank you to the panel. I'm extremely grateful to Colin for stepping in at such short notice. As we've just heard, Colin is the Emeritus Professor at SOAS and was the first Professor of Israel Studies in the United Kingdom. He's a long-standing contributor to the JC, as indeed are all our panel. And among his many books are Israel and the European Left, Between Solidarity and Delegitimization, and The Triumph of Military Zionism, Nationalism, and the Origins of the Israeli Right. Sir Lawrence is Professor Emeritus of War Studies at King's College London and a multiple award-winning author. His two most recent are the brilliant, as I can testify having read it myself, the brilliant Strategy, a History, and his latest book, The Future of War, a History. And he was, as you'll probably know, a member of the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. And on my left, Tim Marshall, who'll probably be familiar to everyone as the former foreign and diplomatic editor of Sky News, and now a best-selling author. His Prisoners of Geography has been on the New York Times list for how many weeks, is it?
I'm glad you brought that up. 60.
60 weeks on the New York Times bestseller week. And his latest, Worth Dying For, The Power and Politics of Flags, is also a bestseller. And he's also the founder of the What and the Why.com, I should say. Now, as for the format tonight, I really want to keep it as informal as possible. My job is to ask questions and try and spark a conversation. We'll try not to be, I don't really want it to be a sort of history. I don't think the panel want it to be a history of Balfour. I think it's important that we put the Balfour Declaration in its historic context first, but really quite like to talk more about the implications on the region and the world of the Balfour Declaration and what it led to. So we'll try and focus on that. And then there'll be time, as you've heard, for questions. I thought maybe we could begin with something extremely current, which was the remark today by Emily Thornberry, who, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who you may know, said in an interview that Balfour should not be celebrated, it should simply be marked. Just wondered what you think of that. So, Tim?
I thought it was a disgraceful remark. I thought it spoke volumes. I thought it told us what we probably already knew. It fits into the narrative of the past 2 years. And I contrast it with the Foreign Secretary's remarks in the Daily Telegraph today. This is what could have been said. This is Boris Johnson now. I see no contradiction in being a friend of Israel and a believer in that country's destiny, while also being deeply moved by the suffering of those affected and dislodged by its birth. The vital caveat in the Balfour Declaration intended to safeguard other communities has not been fully realized. Now that's what I call even-handed and statesmanlike from, I know the person that wrote it for him. And that is what absolutely Miss Thornberry could have said, but instead she chose to say what is in essence an insult, because it says there is nothing to celebrate about the great democracy that is in the Middle East called Israel.
Yes, I'd echo those points. I think if Emily Thornberry is going to be in charge of the diplomatic service. She's proved herself already to be no diplomat. She's reflected Corbyn's view that the Labour Party has no place as a mediator. Corbyn, over the last 30 years, has never been a mediator between Israel and Palestine, but a propagandist for one side and one side only. And this goes against all the talk about peace and reconciliation. It doesn't make any sense at all. Again, following Tim's point, if she had phrased it properly, she could have said the Zionists and their supporters will certainly celebrate the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And I quite understand that the Palestinians and their supporters will see it as a landmark in the history of their problems. I understand that the past can't be changed, but the future can be. And therefore, our role in the Labour Party is to act as mediators between the two parties, and we're very happy to do that. That never happened. And I think it's a lack of socialist morality on her part.
Okay, let's take a step back to the bigger picture. I just want to begin really with a maybe too general a question, but how significant was the Balfour Declaration after all? I mean, it took 31 years for Israel to come about after the Balfour Declaration. I wonder if we were sort of looking at the Balfour Declaration in its historic significance, could you argue that the Holocaust was actually a much more significant aspect in the creation of Israel, or are we right to make such a big deal about Balfour? Lawrence?
These things come in stages, so Balfour was important in terms of legitimizing the idea of a Jewish state. That's why it was important. It's the first time a major power had done this, and it was, at the time, a major power with enormous influence in the region, albeit making different promises to other people at the same time. But it legitimized the idea of a Jewish state. By 1939, you can argue the British, in some way, had moved away from Balfour. They weren't following the logic because they decided that a Jewish state was probably going to cause them more problems with the Arabs than it was worth. So undoubtedly, and this was carried on being true after the war, it wasn't the British who carried the logic of Balfour through. The logic of Balfour was carried through by the Americans. If the Truman administration had taken a different position, I mean, leaving aside the importance and the emotional impact of the Holocaust, nonetheless, if the Truman administration had taken a different position, which it could have done and which had its own Arabists arguing for it, then there wouldn't have been the same support for the State of Israel at the UN. So I think the Balfour sort of gave the whole thing momentum, but it didn't create it by itself, the State of Israel.
I wanted to briefly pick up on something Lawrence said, and I'll be quiet because I'm out of my depth when it comes to history with these guys. The key point that I thought was the legitimization of an idea. And let me go slightly off-piste. When Macedonia left Yugoslavia, well, there is no such country called Macedonia. There's the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. That's its official name, because Greece would not allow a country to be called Macedonia because part of it is called Macedonia. And they knew that if they legitimized a state being called Macedonia, that would be the beginning of the idea that one day that state might join up a little bit with this state. And that's why what look often like small things are actually really, really important things. And for me, that is the underlying meaning of the Balfour Declaration. It is the foundation stone of an idea.
I think I'd agree with that. I think that Weizmann, through the Balfour Declaration, along with Jabotinsky and Sokolov, they built on Herzl's desire to get some sort of international charter. Herzl was ridiculed and marginalized and not taken seriously when he walked the corridors of power through many European chancellors. The Russian Minister of Finance made a joke about he would like to drown millions of Jews in the Black Sea, but he couldn't, and therefore. So this was what Herzl experienced. And Weizmann, in particular, built upon this. And as you say, the very idea that the Jews were a nation in exile came about through the Balfour Declaration, the recognition that the Jews had a right to a homeland, even though it didn't say that in the actual Balfour Declaration. On the question of the Shoah, now it's interesting to note that before the onset of World War II, 1937, there was the Peel Commission, which recommended 2 states. It never came about, and this was before the Shoah. And if it had come about, then certainly probably millions of Jews might have been saved. Of course, that's all speculation. It never came about. The other point about the Shoah is that the vote in the UN on the 29th of November 1947 would never have come about had it not been for Joseph Stalin. Stalin could be actually regarded as one of the founding fathers of the State of Israel. The reason for this volte-face in the spring of 1947 was that Moscow wanted to get rid of the British from the Middle East, stop the Americans from coming in. They wanted a reasonably warm, deep sea port in Haifa, and therefore you suddenly had Gromyko making these pseudo-socialist Zionist speeches at the UN. The irony was that although Stalin and the Russians actually gave the extra votes, because the Zionists had to get 2/3 majority in the vote, well, the Soviets therefore provided these extra votes. The irony is that whereas they were supporting the Zionists externally, internally they were arresting Soviet Jews who wanted to go and fight for Israel.
It is indeed one of the ironies of the whole thing. And the British couldn't fight it. I mean, we know that Bevan was not happy about having to support it. I just want to go back to the context. It's important to remember at the time of Balfour, or certainly just after, first, it was important because it was seen as a way, potentially, of attracting Russia in 1917 when you want to keep them into the war, and of attracting America in 1917 when you wanted to get them into the war. So it had that sort of role. But also, this idea of self-determination was a very powerful idea at the time. You have it when America does join the war, and in 1918, setting the peace terms, Wilson's 14 points. There's a big feature of this idea of self-determination, which he'd never really worked out what it meant, where it should stop, what was the self to be determined, and a lot of the problems that you saw after the First World War, with new states being created out of the wreckage of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian German empires, were the result of a notion of self-determination, of which the Balfour Declaration was one part, and actually took much longer to realise than many of the other parts at the same time, and had exactly the same difficulties as the one nation's self-determination tended to impact on somebody else's.
One of the things I've had most fun doing as editor of the JC is editing our magazine, which is out. There's some copies down here, but which we're distributing with Friday's issue of the paper. I've been able to look at all different aspects of Balfour, and the biggest thing that strikes me, having spent quite a few months now editing various articles and commissioning things, is there's a sort of split between 2 explanations for Balfour. The one that I think probably most of us were brought up on, that I was certainly brought up on, the idea, a sort of more romantic notion that Weizmann basically persuaded Lloyd George and Balfour that this was such a wonderful thing to do, and they thought, yes, that's wonderful, as opposed to the view that I think is probably more grounded in history, which was that it was really the product of great power politics. I mean, you alluded to that with the idea of bringing Russia into the sphere of influence. Yeah. I mean, there were a whole series of contradictory promises from the British during World War I. I mean, I just bullet pointed them here. There were the Hussein McMahon letters, which promised support for Arab independence in return for Arab tribes to fight the Turks. There was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which carved the region up into British and French spheres of influence, which completely ignored the Hussein-McMahon letters. And then, of course, there was the Balfour Declaration itself. So all were directly contradictory, and all were made supposedly in good faith by the Brits. And I just wonder where what you think the balance is, as it were, between that romantic explanation of Balfour and the more realpolitik explanation.
Yeah, shall I go? I look at realpolitik and put it first. Let me put it that way. There's another explanation which a friend of mine, Michael Cohen, who's emeritus professor at Bar-Ilan, put forward. He comes up with the idea that in February 1915, this is 6 months after the outbreak of war, there's the crossing of the Sinai by Turkish troops led by Germans. The British up to that point believed that Sinai was a buffer, and therefore, you know, the area of Egypt particularly was safe. This trek by the Turkish troops suggested that Palestine now became a strategic point of importance, a strategic location for the British, and therefore they had to secure Palestine. Now, when Lloyd George became Prime Minister in December 1916, he took note of this, and he was particularly averse, Michael argues, to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, because he thought the French were getting too large a share of the cake. And therefore, from that point on, you find Sir Mark Sykes becoming quite amenable to the Zionist idea, and indeed to the idea of a Jewish legion. So Lloyd George, you know, there are all sorts of stuff you can quote the popular information, but there's a certain hard-headed realpolitik that these British politicians needed. They needed, as Lawrence suggested, they believed in the international power of Jewry. Therefore, they thought the Jews could keep Kerensky in power in Russia, and they could bring the United States into the war. And Britain was doing quite badly in the theatre of war at that time. Weizmann was very clever in that he played to this. He had nothing behind him, but he played to this. He played on these almost anti-Semitic imagery of the British upper class at that point. And there's a you know, we speak about Lloyd George. I've got to speak to the Lloyd George Society next week. So one of the things I'm going to say to them is that there was something called the Marconi Affair in 1912, whereby Herbert Samuel, who was the first Jew in the cabinet, gave the contract to the Marconi company. They set up all these stations so that everyone would have radio. But there's clearly an example of inside trading there. People made a lot of money out of it, and Lloyd George was fingered as well as others. And Lloyd George writes in a letter talking about this disgusting Jew. You know, it's listed in a letter because he had been blamed for this. Whether they were responsible or not, they got away with it. But it's very clear that there was this upper class snobbery, this disparaging attitude towards Jews. And Weizmann understood it perfectly and played along with it in order to secure this window of opportunity, which eventually secured the Balfour Declaration.
Let me just add one of the three things you mentioned, only the Balfour Declaration was public. The others we now know about, but were not known so much at the time. And I think, you know, you don't need a single motive. People are very good at convincing themselves that what, in fact, extremely self-interested is also romantic and altruistic and totally in keeping with our values. I don't think they would have found that difficult. But like Colin, I tend to, I don't think in the middle of a war you do things wholly for romantic reasons, especially one which is as tough as this one in 1917.
Yep. Well, let's move on to, having done the history, let's talk about the implications of Balfour and so on, and maybe deal with the big question. I mean, one of the things that you hear all the time that underlies almost all debates about the region is that Israel is basically now the cause of all the problems in the Middle East. It's a sort of trope that's trotted out the whole time. Is there any credibility to the argument that Balfour effectively triggered a 100-year conflict between the Jews and the Arabs?
No. I mean, the conflict existed already. There was Zionism, the movement of Jews into Israel, into Palestine, didn't start after Balfour. It already was well underway. There were already tensions, and I think they would have carried on developing. Equally, it was a destabilizing factor. I think it became more of a destabilizing factor after the state was founded, and more of a destabilizing factor after the Arabs were humiliated when they tried to crush Israel when it was first declared in the Wars of Independence, which many people thought Israel was almost bound to lose. And I think all of these, that was a major source of instability because the Arabs, the sort of feudal kingdoms that had particularly in Egypt, that had failed so badly in the War of Independence, were then vulnerable to the Nassers and so on that followed that. So, yeah, I mean, it's an immensely important part of Middle Eastern history, and therefore has had effects on what has been a pretty dismal history for all sorts of reasons. But to say Israel is the only source of the trouble is overstating it.
And also that if it had not been, it would all be sweetness and light and democracies. I mean, the fissures in the Arab societies and the different tribal regions would have been there anyway, and they would not necessarily have formed nation states which flowered into democracies. The strong man would have still have come, Islam would still have come, different ways of trying to govern would all have been there with or without Israel. And, you know, finally, more people are beginning to understand that because of the current sad crises that's there, that, you know, you cannot blame Israel for what is happening in Syria.
Ben Gurion, in an article in 1915, at the beginning of the war, called Towards Our Future, specifically spelled out that the Jews did not wish to dominate or to displace Arabs, that there was room enough for everyone. And I think at the very beginning, the pioneers in Palestine at that time considered themselves the Zionist wing of the revolutionary groups in Russia. This is how they saw themselves. And they deliberately separated Jewish labor from Arab labor in the hope that the Arab fellahin would develop a working class and that they would rebel against their notables, and that the Jewish working class and the Arab working class would work together to build a Palestine. Now, the emphasis being on the class struggle rather than the national struggle. And basically, that never happened because the Arabs were very weak in terms of developing a proletariat and in terms of developing a middle class. So whereas the Jews espoused socialism, a social democratic approach, the Arabs went for pure nationalism and in some cases Islamism. And that's the difference. That's the difference. And as the clash became greater and greater, you found a polarization between these two groups. So that's how I see things at the very beginning.
But there's a second half to the Balfour Declaration, isn't there, that we very rarely pay attention to, which was it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, well, you talk to the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, and they have a very different interpretation of Balfour. I mean, I was talking to somebody, a Palestinian, a couple of weeks ago, who was telling me that all the problems of the region originate from the 1930s, when the British government allowed the Jewish agency to buy land in Israel, but refused to allow the Palestinians to do the same thing. And you know, we can't shy away, can we, from the second half of the Balfour Declaration and the fact that that hasn't come to pass.
No, we shouldn't. I mean, there's two complaints against that statement. One, that it didn't refer to political rights. And secondly, that it's a bit of a catch-all. I mean, the Jews at the time were not a very small minority, but certainly a minority in Palestine. So the suggestion is the non-Jews are the minority, which of course they were. Also, of course, it included Christians as well as Muslims. So it didn't get off to a good start in terms of being reassuring on that point. But I think I agree with Colin. I mean, I think it was the events that came later that aggravated the differences. And there are all sorts of awkward features that are mentioned by Arab commentators about the extent to which Arab landowners sold their land to the Jews. And I mean, it was a much more fluid. There was a danger with these things. We look back at it and we understand now where we've ended up, and we look back and we see the signs of it all developing then. And also with the anti-Semitism as well, which is sort of pretty routine in Britain. You can read stuff from before the First World War, and you look staggered at the crudity of the anti-Semitism. Yet it's often combined with extraordinary respect for individual Jews and so on. It's complex. It's much more fluid. Looking back, if you try to replicate what it seemed like at the time. So relations between Jews and Arabs were always quite complex in the Middle East, but in many countries were perfectly harmonious. So it's a developing relationship rather than one that's transformed forever because we didn't get it quite right in the language of 1917.
Tim, you've spent enormous amount of time in the Middle East reporting and talking to all kinds of different people. So just a curious question, really. Has anyone ever brought up Balfour as being one of the causes of the problems?
Very occasionally you'll hear it, but it's much more you bring up 1948. The British are not, in certain circles, people are not that warm to them sometimes. I remember watching Germany versus England in a football match in a bar in Palestine, and everybody was cheering for Germany because of 1948. But no, I don't think it. I think in the intellectual circles, yes, but at the street level, absolutely not.
Of course, Sykes-Picot has become much more in the news over the last couple of years than Balfour because of what's been going on in Syria and Iraq. And I think, going back to your earlier point, whatever people think about the role of Israel in destabilizing the region, causing trouble, I can't remember a time when conversations on the Middle East spend less time on Israel.
Yeah. ISIS references Sykes-Picot. They may have referenced Balfour, but I'm not aware of it. But
Sykes-Picot's more important.
Yeah, they reference Sykes-Picot.
The what's his name? Al-Bakr, the head of ISIS.
Baghdadi.
Baghdadi, yes. He gave a speech a year or two ago in which he denounced Sykes-Picot when ISIS was at the height of its...
Well, they actually got a bulldozer and they drove it through the sand berm between Iraq and Syria, and to create a gap in it, and they released the video and they said, we have just demolished Sykes-Picot, and in a sense they had.
I think another point I'd like to add is that there has been difficulty in parts of the Arab world in dealing with minorities. The Kurdish problem, for example, the Assyrians were massacred in Iraq in 1932. The Jews were often discriminated against. The Copts in Egypt. So I think there's a difficulty there. And then suddenly you have this group of people, not everyone was from Europe, but the leaders of Zionism were from Europe, and therefore cast in the imagery of white colonialists. And, this proved to be a point of humiliation, I think, for many Arabs. I mean, the cliche that it's the clash of that the two nationalisms arose at the same point in history, I think is very true. But there is no appreciation of why Zionism arose. Zionism is seen as wrong, particularly in Britain today, as Emily Thornberry provided testimony to. Zionism is not wrong, it's different. It doesn't fit into the theoretical framework that is usually acceptable today.
My last point on that, on nothing shall be done which may prejudice. Absolutely right. It was right to be there, and it's right to strive for it. It is a little hypocritical when people quote, certain people quote that, if they're in Hamas or indeed Fatah, when they're not taking care of the civil and religious rights of their own non-Jewish communities.
I wonder if maybe we could play a little counterfactual game now. You mentioned 1948. On at least three occasions, Israel's fought major wars that few people have thought that Israel would win. I just wonder if we could speculate if Israel had lost either of the sort of three main, or 48 and 67 and the Yom Kippur War, where we'd be now if Israel had lost one of those wars. It's a rather enormous question to ask. But I just thought it might be useful to, because we sort of assume that there's an inevitability about where we are in history. And especially in the case of Israel, there's no inevitability about it at all.
Well, the wars got progressively, when the 48 war, 47-48 was the critical one, because, as we know, it was close, it was difficult. If the Arabs had organised themselves more effectively, they could have won, and if that had failed, then there wouldn't have been a Jewish state. The Jews in the rest of the Middle East may well have stayed where they were. We would have had all the problems of reintegration back into Europe, and we know what happened in Poland and so on. So that's in a sense, as counterfactuals go, that's the more straightforward one. I think that after that they become much harder, because by the time you've got a well-established Jewish state, then what happens to Jews if Israel is being defeated becomes a much more difficult question. You just about remember the rhetoric before 67 of Jews being pushed into the Mediterranean and so on and so forth. So if Israel hadn't actually started the war and launched its very successful preemptive strikes, then it would have been very different. Well, the interesting question with 67, which I think is a much more important question, is what would have happened if King Hussein had not believed Nasser and realised that Israel was beating Egypt and just stayed out, because an awful lot of problems that we've had since then would have been avoided if Hussein had stayed out of that war. That seems to be the larger counterfactual. 73, Israel got very close to getting into trouble. Again, it was in trouble. Again, it was the Egyptians holding back, because they realised they were getting outside their comfort zone in terms of air defences. But if they'd and left the Syrians really to cope on their own, but if they'd carried on pushing, the counterfactual then is, would Israel have resorted to its nuclear weapon? So we'll leave you that one to ponder with.
There are various photographs of the people signing the Declaration of Independence in May 1948. One of them is of a smiling Moshe Sharet, who became the first foreign minister and then then Prime Minister in 1953-54. And Charette writes in his diary saying that I felt I was on the edge of a cliff as if a huge gale was blowing because no one knew what to expect. And others have said that they expected that if the Arabs had won in 1948, they would have been hanged, as indeed, for example, in World War I, some of the Nili people were hanged just after General Allenby walked into Jerusalem. I've got no doubt that there would have been terrible reprisals against the Jews had they lost. No doubt about it at all. And one example, I mean, it's often, we often hear about Deir Yassin, where probably brigades of Lehi and the Irgun, who were less disciplined than the Haganah, probably killed many Arab civilians. But what we hear less of is a couple of days before the Declaration of Independence, Jews in Kfar Etzion surrendered to the Egyptians who were coming up from the south and to Arab irregulars. And these unarmed people, over 100, were massacred by Arab irregulars crying, Deir Yassin. And for me, that imagery it sticks in my mind because that writ large is a possibility of what could have happened in 1948. And as Lawrence has said, you know, the other wars, in 1967, it said that people were prepared to dig up parks because they expected very large casualties. And 1973, I think, was more of a draw than a victory for Israel, mainly through Henry Kissinger's pressure. So, you know, we think of Israel as a sort of Prussian superpower. It is a military superpower in the Middle East, but the possibility of it being defeated and of disappearing is always there. Perhaps it's part of the Jewish psyche, but perhaps it's also part of the reality.
I think that people in 1967 took Nasser's rhetoric, took him at his word, and that is one of the reasons why they prevailed.
Let's come a bit more up to date. There's a play on at the moment in the West End, Oslo. But if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. I'd hugely recommend it. Is that as good as it's going to get in terms of peace and Israel reaching an accord with its immediate neighbours and the Palestinian state?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. In the near future, yes, but actually I'm reasonably hopeful in the midterm. I mean, if we want to bring it right up to date, Oslo was a success and it's held. Jordan and Egypt peace has held for more than a generation now, and unless there's untoward events, will continue to hold, and it is the foundation upon which to spread that. What we're seeing now in the Middle East, mostly behind the scenes, is other Arab countries coming round to that viewpoint that it is possible. Now, in public, they still have to do X, Y, and Z. I think it was the Moroccan judo champion refused to shake the Israelis' hand this week at some competition, etc., etc. And the states also have to make these gestures. But behind the scenes, there's an awful lot going on. There's an awful lot of technology being bought by the Arab states from the Israelis. There's an awful lot of toing and froing, shuttle diplomacy going on. As I understand it, the new Saudi, they're putting up $500 billion to build a new city called Neom. And it's going to stretch, the economic zone will stretch into Egypt and Jordan. As I understand it, they will also, when the conditions are right, accept Israeli enterprise into this economic zone. I think that's the longer, medium to long term. In the short term, Oslo's about it.
I mean, it's that, or you could argue that the Camp David declarations at the end of the 2000 would probably describes what a peace would look like. I mean, we've known all the way through what it looks like. It's just totally impossible to get the politics right or to get sufficient trust between both sides. And at the moment, there's no interest, but there are things going on. I mean, partly what Tim mentions, and the economic side is very important. A lot of the Gulf states are interested in working with Israel and do so behind the scenes. The Saudis have discovered all sorts of common interests with Israel, not least on Iran, which carries its own dangers, I should say. It's not simple and straightforward, but the Saudis have seen the Israelis as sort of as allies, informal allies, in pressing.
They even allegedly were going to open the airspace for if there was ever going to be an attack on Iran.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a lot going on in that regard. However, if you talk to Saudis and others, they come back to the point that whatever they may think about the Palestinians, which often isn't very high, they're just not a group they can disregard, and that everything would be so much easier if you could find some way to have a deal on that. I think the other thing just to keep in mind is the severity of the Saudi-Iranian tension in the region at the moment, which influences everything that's going on. I mean, we Americans tend to focus a lot on ISIS, but even behind all of that, the fear of Iran as a radical, destabilizing force goes very deep, and that could lead to something quite big as well. Israel's a side player in all of that, so it's not at the center of it. But that is reshaping. I mean, there are big shifts going on in Arab politics, but as we know with all our politics as we conceive them in Europe at the moment with Catalonia, these old issues don't go away. They keep on reappearing, so we can't assume that the Palestinian issue will somehow be consigned to history and we can just forget about it.
I haven't seen Oslo, but I look forward to seeing it. I think one of the points about Oslo, the Oslo Accord, was that it broke through this polarization of Israel against Palestine, Palestine against Israel, in that those people on both sides, on part of the Israelis, on the part of the Palestinians, those people who wanted peace, were ranged against their rejectionists. And the rejectionists on the Palestinian side coincided with the rise of Islamism. And Oslo was unsuccessful because it did not promise, it promised peace, but it did not provide security, because the Oslo years also marked the advent of the suicide bombers. And if you ask Israelis today, they will say that peace and security are not one of the same. They'd sooner have security. And that is why people will vote for Netanyahu, despite everything, because he is seen as the guarantor of security. Peace and the settlements are a secondary matter. And particularly at this point in history, when there's an Islamist storm blowing outside the door, the Netanyahu and the Israeli government prefer to batten down the hatches, and that allows them space to follow an ideological agenda. So this is the essential difficulty at the moment, that people are practicing the politics of stagnation.
I mean, it seems to me that whilst everybody pays lip service to the notion of a two-state solution, almost everybody, the fashionable move now is to say that the real move is towards a one-state solution and that two states are dead, effectively. I just wonder what your take on that is.
That has become the fashion over the past 12 months. I don't think it's viable. I don't think it's going to happen. It's just people saying, well, let's try something new, a one-state solution. It's not going to happen. And again, the British today, with Mr. Johnson, he's actually saying, he ends, Britain will give whatever support we can in order to close the ring and complete the unfinished business of the Balfour Declaration. He lays out what we all know, the parameters of the deal, and says that the UK, which of course is not quite the player it used to be in this, but it's going to furnish its credentials and say we're prepared to help. The two-state solution is still, for me, the only game in town, even if no one's playing it at the moment.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, the fact that you'll find adherents of the one-state solution on the extremes of both sides is all you need to know, in a way. Either this is going to be a Jewish state or it's going to be an Arab state, and in the end, it's easier to have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. So I think there's no way that Israel can do what it might have been thought it was able to do after the territories were occupied in the first place. It just isn't the hostility and the difficulty. We've seen it. We've seen how difficult it is to occupy a whole population that really doesn't like it and is going to keep on fighting. The difference, and we have to keep this in mind, is one of the wars that we don't mention so often, but I think was as important in reshaping Israel's security problems, was the invasion of Lebanon in '82. It was an enormous mistake. It got worse because it might have worked quite well, but Israel pushed it too hard and created new enemies, Hezbollah being the obvious one. Hezbollah remains a formidable threat to Israel, which didn't exist really in the same way before '82. So I think the security problem is now much more than Gaza or the West Bank. The security problem is very much Hezbollah, and that is bound up with this wider ISIS-Iran sphere.
I agree with Tim and Lawrence that the one-state solution sounds good, but it doesn't make any sense. And if you aim eventually at let's say, the United States of the Middle East, inevitably you have to go through a two-state solution in order to reach that, because the national hostility on both sides is so profound, it would take several generations before people actually begin to consider the dissolving of borders. I'd like to pick up on one point here, which Stephen reminded me about. We often talk about two-state solution. The Labour Party, Corbyn, has recently been talking about a two-state solution. No one mentions or maybe they do, they talk about the right of self-determination of the Palestinians, which is quite right. But no one talks about the right of self-determination of the Jews. And that's a problem for people like Corbyn, because 2013, he spoke about the Balfour Declaration as being a historic mistake. They don't recognize that the Jews have a right to be in Israel. They say it's a fait accompli. Okay, they've been there, there's an Israeli people. But there's not that ideological definition, that ideological acceptance that the Jews have a right to national self-determination in Israel.
Also, following on from that, Young Labour passed a motion for a one-state solution, against a two-state solution. So the next generation coming up is bought into even more than that.
Which prompts the thought, maybe we should bring this full circle and talk about, if you told me I was going to introduce, 6 months ago, if you'd said to me I'd begin and sort of end a conversation about Balfour by talking about Emily Thornberry twice, I'd have thought you were mad. But maybe we should bring it full circle to Emily Thornberry. And just, what has changed why has the left, it's not just the left, a lot of central, neutral opinion, as it were, has changed its view of Israel. For most of Israel's existence, well, for the first 20, 30 years of Israel's existence, certainly in this country, it was revered and plucky Israel and so on. And yet, in so many circles now, Israel is a synonym for evil oppression. But what has changed? Not so much about Israeli behaviour, but what's changed in the mindset here that's led to that?
Shall I go? Sure. Yeah. If we go back to 1947, to post-war Britain, the further left that you went in the Labour Party, the more pro-Zionist they were. Nye Bevan, founder of the NHS, threatened to resign from Attlee's government because of British policy in Palestine. In the 1950s, for example, I remember reading a review of Nye Bevan of Nasser's book, his name I can't remember at the moment, in 1955-56, and he derided him as a reactionary. Now, of course, all of this is airbrushed out of existence today. Tony Benn, or as he was then known as the Anthony Wedgwood Benn, wrote every week in the Jewish Vanguard, the paper of Politzian, uber-Zionist articles that's almost embarrassing to read. The point of change, I think, took place during the period of decolonization. In 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana. And in one sense, the Palestinians fitted in much more to that narrative than did the Israelis in the 1960s. The time of Che Guevara, the time of Vietnam War, against apartheid. So what I'm saying is this mindset that Zionism was wrong, that Israel was a settler colonial state, took place before the settlement drive on the West Bank, took place before the Six-Day War. Now, of course, the settlement drive after 1968 didn't help. It cemented that view. So what started off on the periphery in the 1960s has moved to the centre. We think that Corbyn and the people around him are old Labour. They're not. They're far left. They're outside of Labour. And these were people in the 1960s who were on the periphery. And with the coming of social media, and particularly the young people who are profoundly ignorant about the history of the Jews and the history of Zionism, we have this situation today.
I think it's even a little bit more bleak than that. Like I said, I'm going around spreading gloom and despondency around the nation. Trotsky got a nice pick in his head. You know, it could be worse. Kerensky was given the elbow. If you look at the purges in Czechoslovakia, if you look at some of the purges in East Germany, you know who's getting purged here. So there's always been that strain in the extreme left. And I do think that Mr. Corbyn, Seamus Milne, and quite a few of the group around them, they're not what I used to regard as the Labour Party. They really are of those guys in the 1960s and the 70s who, on a wet Wednesday, would sit around in some dreary pub in the cold, nursing pints and saying, "One day, comrade," never thinking for the life of them that they would ever get anywhere near any power. But that they were ultra-radicals. But they have moved into the centre, and they're bringing people with them. I also talk to a lot of young people who have absolutely no idea about their beliefs and their views. They just see this great guy, the absolute boy. They have no concept of some of the beliefs that they have.
But it's not just Corbyn, is it? I mean, it predates by quite a while. I mean, it's
yeah. I mean, you were too learning my politics during the late 60s. You could feel it happen. You could see it happen around you. I used to be in the Young Liberals then. And a number of them went off to Libya after Gaddafi. And they came back really quite enthusiastic supporters of this cause in a way that was quite remarkable. And many of them went on to run magazines and so on, supported by Gaddafi. I'm not suggesting a simple conspiracy, but you could feel the change. I think the big change with Israel moved from being the victim and holding on to its existence by a thread, to being seen as the oppressor. I mean, I don't think we can escape those images and how it came to be seen. Israel was the strong guy, and the Arabs were the ones who were getting beaten up. And it's in the nature of the way that the young and the media present things that it's hard to have sympathy for the guys who've got the.
But we always come back, Lawrence. We always come back to why that one. I mean, an example is this week when Netanyahu comes, and just as Mr. Corbyn could not find time at the Labour conference to go to Labour Friends of Israel, and yet this same evening went to 3 separate events within spitting distance of that event, even though he said he was too busy. He's now not going to see Mr. Netanyahu. Now, it doesn't matter if you find him an unpleasant character or not, the Israeli Prime Minister. If you want to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, which he does, you need to meet people like that. And is he going to turn down if President Xi comes and is invited to dinner? No, he's not. And so I always come back to this, why this one? And it's because they are so steeped in it, in this romantic notion. But there's often a darker side that I don't think they even know they have.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, one of my earlier political experiences was being denounced as a Zionist by Jeremy Corbyn's brother, Piers, when I was trying to go for an office in National Union of Students, never even been to Israel by that point. So I've watched the Corbyns with great interest ever since, and actually some gratitude, because goodness knows what would have happened to me if I'd got a position in the National Union of Students. I think we need just to be careful not to assume it's just a group of clever manipulators who've managed to take over the Labour Party, because it goes far wider than that. And I think it's partly because we have identified, I mean, people, Brits, have identified quite a lot with Israel. They are, the Israelis talk like us. They sound like us. They could be us. And therefore, as it's slightly different from talking about a country where they're talking a completely different language and they don't aspire to the same ideals and so on. It's because Israel is so close that there is a sort of sense, not betrayal may be the wrong word, but that we have a responsibility that we don't have for other countries. So I think it's unwise just to say that it's because of this collection of characters that there is a problem on this issue. I think also we have this continuing thing about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that you sort of keep on giving the pass on anti-Semitism, or anti-Zionism, because you say it's perfectly okay to criticize Israel. That doesn't make you anti-Semite. Yeah, we agree that. But you almost sort of say it's almost obligatory then to criticize Israel, because then you're a good Jew rather than a bad Jew. I mean, so I think that sort of, we've got caught by that debate, that we continually giving the pass on Zionism, and there isn't a readiness to defend it, because it sounds like defending the worst excesses of the Netanyahu government rather than defending the idea of a Jewish homeland.
I've been trying to catch up on the news, but I believe the JC spoke about the expulsion of Moshe Machova. He was one of the leaders of Matzpen, which was a far-left Israeli group. Now, he's been expelled from the Labour Party, etc., and they're protesting about it. Now, I did some research on this at the Hashomer Hatzair archives in Israel. Matzpen broke away from the Communist Party in Israel, and there was a phrase that they used. It was Dor ha-Trotskyisti Bamidbar. They considered themselves the Trotskyist generation in the desert, because no one was listening to them. And now Moshe Machova is screaming blue murder because they won't let him into the Labour Party. The people around Corbyn, this privileged elite that come from privileged backgrounds, people like Seamus Milne and Andrew Murray, were either members of the Communist Party of Great Britain or very close to it. And they belonged to the pro-Kremlin faction of the Communist Party. Not the Euro-communists, not the people that wanted reform, but the pro-Soviet faction, the people that opposed Gorbachev, that opposed Perestroika, that opposed glasnost, that didn't think too much of people like Andrei Sakharov. These are the people who are now in Corbyn's inner circle. I reviewed a book recently by Sean Matgamna, who's one of the few people on the far left who protest against all the things we've been speaking about, again, about the denigration of Zionism, about the stereotyping of Jews, etc., etc. It's called The Left in Disarray. And he refers to this as a Stalinization by the British left, by the Labour Party. And even Trotskyists can Stalinize. And I think there's something to that. I think there really is.
On that fascinating concept of Trotskyites Stalinizing, maybe we should open it up to questions now.
Well, first of all, Lawrence, you're quite right to make the point that in the 1940s it was the American Jews who got Israel over the top. In fact, it was Abba Hilla Silver from my hometown in Cleveland who really did the heavy lifting. But had it not been for Balfour, my ancestors would not have moved to Palestine in 1921 for the Third Aliyah. So let's give it credit. I'm talking about Tim's comment about the removal of the boundary between Iraq and Syria by ISIS. But ISIS isn't the name of the game anymore. The boundaries aren't there. But the boundaries aren't there because of another reason. It's called Hash Ashab. It's called the Iranian Shia proxies, who are cleverly under the radar, moving in to the vacuum created by the defeat of Daesh. And I don't see enough attention being paid. You mentioned Hezbollah and the mistake and how, but it's gotten way beyond. What Iran has plans for Syria dwarfs anything that Hezbollah has done in Lebanon. And I give you an example of what might have happened to Israel in the early days had they lost a war. Look at Kurdistan in Iraq right now.
It's not getting much play because of fatigue in the audience and the media, perhaps. Look, Hezbollah have lost at least 3,000 fighters in Syria. Iran has lost at least 3,000 of its troops, including the Revolutionary Guard. The Afghan Shia, which are the cannon fodder, they're throwing the Afghan Shia into this fight, and they are putting a lot of blood and treasure into it, and yes, Iran means to control Syria eventually. It's a little off from Balfour, but that is what is circulating around. You may have seen an uptick recently in Israeli airstrikes, and that's on the Hezbollah columns that are coming through because some of the rockets that they're now bringing through, because there is a corridor from Tehran to Baghdad to Damascus to Beirut, and it's a Shia corridor, and that in essence is partly what the whole war is about. One side must keep that corridor open from the Med to Tehran, and another side must cut that corridor, and that fight is ongoing, and it's not really explained in the news much.
Right. Tim's explained
There's
it.
a gentleman, with your hand up, so
David Lawrence.
No, carry on, then I'll come to the other chap.
David Lawrence, former member of Kibbutz Mahanaim in the Upper Galilee. In 1949, the Jordanians annexed what's now the West Bank. After that, and before 1967, was there any indication of a rebellion by, or rather resistance to that, by the indigenous Arab population in the West Bank?
It was an issue. It became a bigger issue after 1967 because if you look at Resolution 242 and other sort of great moments in attempted diplomacy, the issue was Gaza and Egypt, Golan and Syria, and the West Bank and Jordan. And a lot of the politics was about Jordan eventually giving up responsibility for the West Bank. So you would have had there was a completely different set of political possibilities at one point if Israel had been able, as it tried to do a number of times, to negotiate with Amman. I mean, Jordan was just never strong enough to see it through against the objections of other Arab states. But we tend to forget that part of the complication of the peace process was that the Palestinians, PLO, took responsibility for the West Bank away from Jordan. And you see residues of that, of course, with Temple Mount and so on. And of course, you know, one of the bloodiest battles that was ever fought was between the Palestinians and the Jordanians in Black September.
There is a modern version of this, actually, is that one of the ideas doing the round in the White House from Jared Kushner is that the Jordanians could lead a peacekeeping force in the West Bank, which is going almost full circle. It's not a bad idea if everybody agrees.
Well, it works. I think there are a lot of people who talk about the Palestinians in 1917 or Palestinians before that. I don't believe there was a Palestinian people as such at that point in time. But there has been a growing national awareness due to the fact that they're in reaction to both Israelis and Palestinians. And therefore, I do believe there was a Palestinian people, let's say in 1967 and afterwards. And they began to feel more Palestinian than Jordanian. So 1976, I think there were the first elections, municipal elections, I believe, on the West Bank. And the Jordanian side faction lost. And the PLO, the Palestinian national side, did win. In addition, you said that Jordan occupied the West Bank, which is clear. But Egypt also occupied Gaza. And Nasser suppressed both the Muslim Brotherhood and suppressed the Communist Party in 1954 because he didn't want any opposition. So I think my sense is that at that time, there was little Palestinian national opposition in the West Bank, apart from maybe Islamists and perhaps the few communists that they were. But there was certainly a lot of opposition after 1967.
Yes, the row behind, about too long, that's it.
Hi, it's Moish Robinson. About a month ago, I was sitting in a meeting in our factory in the south of Israel with our favourite subcontractor from the West Bank. And we got round to the conversation of politics, and I asked him a question I've been asking many times before, why Arafat did not accept 98% that was offered to him by Ehud Barak in exchange for a peace agreement. And he said, and he answered this, he said, until our own leaders will stop their own self-interest and really care about their own people, there will not be peace with Israel, and there can never be peace with Israel. And that was his comment. But my question to the panel, if I might, is England has, in 1947, we could say, made a bit of a hash of the Indian-Pakistan treaty. We certainly have not done ourselves proud in Libya with Gaddafi. It would be questionable about whether we had done ourselves proud in Iraq. Do you think it's time that England stopped trying to meddle in Middle Eastern affairs where they really do not understand the kind of culture that leads these people to not embrace our type of democracy?
I mean, I've taken the view that everybody gets the Middle East wrong, including those who live there. I mean, it's a graveyard of foreign policies. So we're not unique. And of course, we're talking back to a time when we had we'd taken for ourselves imperial responsibilities, which is not quite the same as meddling. I mean, we're beyond meddling. You know, the period we're talking about is, beginning with Balfour, is when the assumptions behind colonialism, of which we'd been a prime exponent, were beginning to be challenged. Woodrow Wilson was challenging them. And through the whole League of Nations period, there was an uneasy relationship between self-government and preparing for it. And the whole idea of a mandate was to differentiate it from old-fashioned colonialism, though it looked to those involved like old-fashioned colonialism. So, we're talking about a move away from a certain set of assumptions about how the world could be organized when, as Sykes could draw a line and say this is how it's going to be, and that's how it was going to be. We're way, way, way far from that. As far as, we don't have a great record, and you're correct to point to 1947 as a particularly bad year, because we screwed up the partition of the Indian subcontinent and we screwed up the partition of Palestine. So it's not great. And far more died, of course, in the breakup of the Raj than died as a result of Palestine, just much bigger. What I think we have to be careful about is assuming that people don't share our views of democracy and so on. I think, even in Iraq, when people were given a chance to vote, they voted. They wanted to vote. There's plenty of evidence of a readiness to accept some of our views about how political processes should be organized and their value. Always difficult, but readiness to accept. But you don't have the institutional structures. And without the institutions and the rule of law and so on to make it work, it tends to fall apart. But I don't think it's the people's fault or the culture's fault. It's an institutional fault.
I think you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't meddle, which is one word. When the Americans are policing the world, everyone gets very angry. When they're not, massive vacuums happen and huge violence breaks out and people want them to police the world again. We used to be that powerful. We're not anymore. It was inevitable we would do what we did around the world. We had an empire. I'm not making a case for or against that. It was just simply a reality. And if you cared about India, then you cared about that part of the world that had the Suez Canal, etc., etc. It was inevitable. Now, A, we're hollowing out our military forces. B, that we're not going anywhere in the Middle East with boots on the ground for a very long time because of the public mood. Because of what happened in the last decade. And what we can do is not meddle. We can offer our good services as equals and friends. I mean, we need to go back out into the world as equals and friends, not as colonialists. But Britain is the 6th largest economy, United Nations seat on the Security Council, the biggest armed forces in Europe. It has a role in the world. It has a role to play in the world. But I, personally would like it to be a different role to the one it played in the last century.
Yes, just there. Just wait for the microphone.
Just for Elaine Bernstein, just for Tim Marshall, when you said the Oslo Accord, this is as good as it's going to get, but not in the medium term and not in the long term. As someone just so hopeful, can you quantify what you mean in terms of years by the medium term and the long term?
Damn. If the current rate of engagement that has been going on in the last 5 years continues over the next 5 years, I think you can have enough political pressure put on both sides by the real players in the region to actually have a genuinely good stab again at a wider Oslo within 5 years. Within 5 years. And a lot of that will be based on economics and great power politics and the realization that has seeped through that the Middle East is not all about Israel and Palestine. It's about a lot more. And if they could get over that, they could advance a lot more. The current leadership in Saudi Arabia is absolutely fascinating, the Crown Prince. The current leadership in the UAE, they seem to understand the way the modern world works, and they are not as ideologically bound as before. And if they can bring the people with them, or if it's indeed the other way around, I think within 5 years they can have another very, very good stab at a proper peace deal.
And is that because, despite, or simply coincident with President Trump?
The question is in 5 years whether he'll, or in the next 5 hours where he'll still.
Despite and because. Despite because I don't think that his team is going to be able to pull this off, but they are working very, very hard. Jared Kushner is in Saudi Arabia this week, in fact. Now, exactly why, I'm not sure, but I think they will have, whilst he was there, will have talked about. He's got a guy in the embassy and in the consulate in Jerusalem that is putting a plan together. I'm not saying it's going to work, but the dynamics, because the world is greater than Trump, and America has presidents and it has interests, and the presidents come and go, and this president will come and go. Who knows when? But so, you know, I don't take much notice of him as an individual. It's better to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is that within a few years now, I think it is possible to put together a proper Oslo plus deal. And I haven't thought that for 15 years.
Just worth noting, one of the things that's going on at the moment is attempt to get a rapprochement between Hamas and the PLO, which is an important part of the peace, because so long as you have that division, then it was absolutely impossible to get an agreement. If you can fuse those two together and with a different leadership, then again it becomes part of the peace.
Lots of little things.
Things.
Lawrence will know. This week, the Palestinian Authority took over the border crossing at Rafah. The middle of next month, I think, the Palestinian Authority takes over the governance of Gaza in a unity government. For the first time, again, since they fell apart, Fatah and Hamas are going to make a stab at coming together, and this is being put together by the outside world. And there's all these steps are leading in one direction, and it is a positive direction in a few years' time. If they can get all the ducks in a row, there will be other people that will be desperately trying to shoot the ducks out of the sky.
I suppose the rider to that is, what's the place of ideology both in Israel and in Palestine? I've always believed that you could negotiate with Palestinian nationalists, but I've always had great doubts about whether one could negotiate with Palestinian Islamists who did not have not come through the same political process as the nationalists, who will not recognize that the Jews have a right to national self-determination. And on the other side, Netanyahu's ongoing settlement drive is partly ideological, partly security. Again, will he risk alienating the far right in his government, people like Bennett, and to some extent Lieberman, and others? These are basic questions. It sounds a bit like pouring cold water on aspirations, sure, but one has to distinguish between wishful thinking and the reality of ideology in both the Israeli and Palestinian camps.
Yeah. You never go far wrong by being pessimistic on the Middle East. But
yes.
Stephen Siegel, I wonder where the BBC figures in Balfour and what the panel think of their approach or lack of approach.
They weren't around at the time of Balfour. I think the BBC, again, in the sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't position. I was involved tangentially many years ago with one of the an internal investigation the BBC did into its Middle East coverage. And very tangentially, I wasn't actually doing the work. But it was it was quite interesting that just how the problems that struck me with the BBC's coverage were not bias, just the difficulty of providing context. which is one of the things we've been talking about this evening, which is a problem for the media generally, an even greater problem with social media, is that you pick up a reference and you see something. Unless you know quite a lot, you're going to miss it, and people just don't spend the time trying to find out. And if you're a news organisation, and Tim will speak more to this than I can, if you're a news organisation, the editors are going to get very impatient if you spend a lot of time trying to give a lot of historical context. But if you don't know the historical context, especially with the Middle East, you miss so much.
I actually don't watch television news very much anymore. Seriously, I don't. I think the BBC will bend over backwards to try and be balanced in some whatever coverage it gives this week. I don't think the great British public actually care very much about this issue at all, either Balfour or Israel, to be perfectly honest with you. As for context, yes, I absolutely believe so much in context, and I'm very heartened for the viewing figures of for the Vietnam War series, 14-part series, and lots of people are watching. I think there is a thirst for context, and I hope the pendulum swings back, but Twitter is militating against me.
We've probably got time for one more question. There were a few. Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm quite surprised that the heading for this conference is the Balfour Declaration. As I recall, the white paper the British brought out in the late 30s, and forgive me for my lack of historical knowledge, I always felt that kind of negated the Balfour Declaration and led Ben-Gurion to say, we will fight the white paper as if there were no war, and we will fight the war as if there were no white paper. Would the panel like to comment on that at all?
Yeah, it was the white paper of 1939. By that time, it was very clear to the British that there would be that the outbreak of war was imminent, and therefore they had to row back. In fact, they spent the interwar years rowing back from the Balfour Declaration, but even more so at that particular point in time. The Peel Commission in 1937 proposed 2 states, and that led nowhere. There was the Woodhead Commission, which effectively scuppered it. And therefore, in 1939, the White Paper suggested that the British would allow in 15,000 Jews per year for 5 years, 75,000. And after that, it would be up to the Arabs of Palestine to decide if any more wished to go in. And this is on the eve of war. Of course, no one knew that the Shoah would occur at that point, but people certainly knew that there was a dramatic persecution of Jews during the 1930s, during the time when the war clouds were gathering in Europe. So that was the white paper. And as you said, Ben-Gurion obviously had to side with the British in their war against the Germans. Not everyone did. Certainly the Stern group didn't. Abraham Stern, in fact, was thought that he could deal with the German conquerors. Even Menachem Begin was not absolutely certain. But Ben-Gurion was very clear. You know, you had to side with the British against the Nazi beast. On the other hand, you had to fight the white paper because it would allow in 75,000 Jews from the millions in Europe, the millions that actually perished over the course of 5 years.
I'm not in the least surprised it's called the Balfour Evening. In 2037, I look forward to Stephen inviting me back again to discuss the Peel Commission, and whenever Lord Caradon, it'll be 100 years since Lord Caradon drafted Resolution 242, we can perhaps not come back for that one. But it's 100 years since Balfour, and it's, you know, we are talking about it because it's the centenary, and it is a very useful exercise because also you also see where you stand, and also where other people stand, because there's going to be an awful lot of demonstrations on Saturday.
Well, the great joy of being a chairman of an event like this with a panel as distinguished as this is that you don't have to do very much. I just have to say a few trigger words and let them all speak. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. So, you know, a huge thanks to our incredibly brilliant panel. But I'd also like to thank the team at JW3 for hosting us in such a smooth and perfect way. But in a special thanks to the JC's Lee Glassman, who has worked tirelessly for pretty much 3 days non-stop, first on Shabbat UK and now on this. And I didn't realise it was actually his birthday, and he worked all through it on our event. So thank you very much, Lee, for that. And thank you, last of all, thank you all for coming.
Then it just remains for me to say a very few words on behalf of the audience. We've been extremely fortunate to have such learned journalists and academics, and to have your articulate thoughts too. So a final thank you to Tim Marshall, Lawrence Friedman, Colin Schindler, our chair Stephen Pollard, and to the Jewish Chronicle.